So 5G4D has been going for nearly 5 years now, and I'm sure many of you will have missed some of the early interviews because you weren't there at the beginning. I mean, why would you have been? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release some classic episodes from some legends of the industry that you might have missed. And so I hope you enjoy these shows, and I hope you enjoy the brand new ones that come out every 2 weeks. So thank you for listening, and enjoy. Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is a titan in miniature wargaming. A graduate in archaeology with classics and ancient history, he's best well known for designing the games that have formed the hobby. He designed the Warhammer Fantasy Battles, as well as Warhammer 40,000. Since leaving Games Workshop, he's gone on to co-own Warlord Games and design Beyond the Gates of Antares. My guest this week is Rick Priestley. Rick, welcome to the cabin.
Hi, Ben. I'm very pleased to be here.
So to begin then, how sort of difficult was it for you to choose the 5 games that you wanted to take to Doomsday with you?
It was quite tricky. I did have a few versions, but in the end, what I've done is I've chosen 5 games, which I think tell us a little bit about my life in gaming. It was strange because I had to miss so many out, and there were so many that I thought, oh no, I'd quite like to mention that. I'd like to mention this, perhaps we'll get a little bit of a chance to talk about those other games as part and parcel of the 5. But I narrowed it down to 5 in the end. So yeah, tricksy, but got there.
You know, it's interesting speaking to a mini war gamer in that, you know, I'm primarily a board gamer. And so when I think of a game, I just don't think of the rules. I think of the whole thing, the components, the board, the art, all of this. Is it a different mindset for a mini war gamer when you think of a game? Are you thinking primarily of a rule set and the componentry is sort of secondary?
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes you have to bear in mind that those components can vary hugely. So if you're writing, let's say, an ancient-themed war game, you usually have to take into account that someone might have an ancient Egyptian army with chariots, and someone else might have a Seleucid army with phalangites, and so on and so forth. It's like a completely flexible in those terms. On the other hand, a lot of modern miniature games in particular tend to have fixed component elements. So you do get those kind of elements in miniature war games. But traditionally, they're fairly few and far between. You really have to have a broad approach. So I do think of it primarily as a set of rules. But because you don't have the component elements, those rules usually have to encompass things that in a board game would be taken for granted. Like you move 1 or 2 or 3 spaces, well, you don't have spaces. So you have to define movement in terms of the geometry.
And sort of, are you a gifted mathematician? When I speak to game designers, it seems that's I think one of the reasons I would sort of never get involved in that area because my mathematics is appalling. Does the maths come easy to you, or is it something you struggle with?
No, it is fairly easy, but it's not particularly sophisticated. I mean, I only read maths to O level, which is basic in the UK, but I never found it particularly difficult. It's really just, the geometry is simple. I mean, there's nothing complex about it, and the probabilities. Well, you're not dealing with anything earth-shattering. A lot of it is instinctive and common sense. I mean, the way that dice works and the basic dice probability works is easy enough to intuit. You don't need to do the hard maths particularly, but it's often more useful to sit down and write random numbers, or just generate random numbers, and then apply those random numbers from a random point into your calculations. But yeah, I never found it hard, but you do need a fairly good grasp of basic maths. As I say, nothing too complicated.
So I'm coming at this from the outside. I've played a few rounds of a few mini war games, but I'm certainly not a mini war gamer, and it seems to me there are a lot of similarities between games. How do you differentiate between them when designing them? What can you do? What techniques can you use to make sure that your game feels different from others?
I think that's pretty much the same as a board game. I mean, I do play board games as well, and certainly have played board games when I was younger. You can have a novel mechanic, which might be actually based upon a particular widget, or a set of special dice or something like that. But that's common with board games too. And similarly, you might have a mechanical variation which is either unique to that game or unique in expression to that game. So, for example, in the bolt action game, there's a set of specific dice which give you 6 different orders. But you could equally well just have an ordinary dice numbered 1 to 6 and a little chart. But you don't. You have the widget. So that's it gives it a certain feel and a certain character. With fantasy games, you've got the opportunity to create a fantasy world. So you're suddenly inviting people to participate in a story. It's a narrative. But that's also the case with board games sometimes. So I don't think there's a huge difference. And I have actually designed board games in the past. And, so I'm fairly... I wouldn't say I'm a huge board game player anymore, mostly because most of my friends aren't. But I still buy the odd one, and Lindsay, my wife Lindsay, and I occasionally play the odd board game. We have to play board games which 2 people can play, which is never quite right. I always think of board games as something where you have a group of people.
So let's go back to the beginning then. You studied archaeology at university. Were you always drawn to history?
Yeah, probably always had at least a kind of emotional attachment to history, not necessarily in an academic way, but because you just grow up with stories based in history. You grew up with Ivanhoe on the telly and Robin Hood, and things like that. And later on, war films, World War II war films were big in the 60s. Cowboy films. So history was just part and parcel of the stories that we told each other, which people were naturally presenting in all sorts of media. Same with comics, all the comics we bought as kids in the 60s were full of historical reference. It was just how we were, so I don't think I would describe my interest in history as unusual or extraordinary in any way. It was just what we were exposed to growing up. And I come from Lincoln. Lincoln's a Roman foundation, and we had a lot of Roman history presented to us at school because of that. So yeah, I guess it was just part of our upbringing, and it's in the blood in that respect.
And was there any era of history that particularly fascinated you? Were you particularly fascinated by the Roman era, or? Yeah,
I'd say that my primary interest in history to this day is in sort of archaeological history. So it's prehistory to a large extent, but also the Roman era and the invasion of Britain. Because of all those links, to some extent, it's something I've always been interested in. And the first, second century AD, what I call the early imperial phase of Roman history, is probably my go-to, if you like.
And so when did gaming enter your life then? And was it always sort of war games, history-based games, or did you get into the hobby through something else?
Well, in terms of toy soldier games, I think the first toy soldier game I picked up, I would be about 11 years old. And it was actually a World War II based war game called Battle, Practical Wargaming by Charles Grant. And that book was new at the time. I just happened to see it in a local bookshop, and I think I had a school prize that I was spending, so as a book token. And I found that book. So I was looking for something to spend it on, and I found that book, and it's an introduction to how to play war games. So it almost worked as an instruction manual in how to put a war game together. At the time, I wouldn't have realised that, because it was the first war game book I'd ever read. But looking back on it, I think that was quite influential in the way I approach war games and designing war games. And in particular, that design is an inherent part of playing war games. So to some extent, my hobby has never been just playing war games. It's always been creating war games.
And so, you're famous for creating games that exist in a fantasy and sci-fi world. Were you also drawn to those as a young man?
Yeah, probably from the time of reading The Hobbit. Bear in mind, by that time it was the early 70s. I think I read The Hobbit when I was 13, something like that. That book in particular was very big in the counterculture, and the science fiction and fantasy were very rooted in that counterculture of the time. They weren't respected genres, but they were academically, but they were championed by young people and by what was then contemporary modern music. If you listen to things like contemporary Hawkwind, early 70s Hawkwind, or Led Zeppelin, they all reference fantasy subjects or science fiction subjects, and we as a group, me and my friends, we played war games, but we also read science fiction books, and we read fantasy books, and things like Michael Moorcock, who wrote a whole number of series of books which portray battle, and fantasy subjects always tended to have elements of warfare and combat in them.
So your first game then is a classic that was sort of re-released recently, and this is Escape from Colditz. Why this game? Was this game inspirational to you?
Yeah, well, I wanted to choose a game that was that kind of was not just the miniature wargame side of it, because we, as a group of friends, we all played miniature war games, and we got together at our houses and played miniature war games. But we also played board games, and we also played card games, and we played a lot of card games, including just regular card games like Whist and Black Maria and so on and so forth. I think that variety of games gives you a certain breadth when it comes to designing miniature war games. So I didn't want to just include miniature war games in my list, and so I had to pick one. I had to pick one that was not miniature war game, and which to some extent summed up or epitomised the sort of gaming we're doing. And we played lots of games. So Escape from Colditz was probably my personal favourite, but we also played a whole variety of other things, Risk being one, things like that. And there was stock market games where you're trading stocks and shares, and of course Monopoly and Cluedo a little bit, but those sort of family games were a little. We have stuff that was a little bit more erudite than that on the whole. Escape from Colditz I chose because it's beautifully presented as a game, which makes a lot of difference, I think. So it's very appealing. The rule book has like facsimile of I think it's like World War II identity cards and things like this. All the sort of fake things that the prisoners in Colditz were making. I don't know how familiar people are with the Colditz backstory these days.
It was certainly a thing when I was a kid, but I'm not sure it's well known nowadays.
Yeah, during World War II, the obviously Germans took many Allied prisoners, and the Allied prisoners were put into prison camps, and some of them kept trying to escape. It's very annoying. Some of them were eternally escaping, and they became a problem for the Germans because they didn't really want to shoot them out of hand, or they sometimes resort to that if they were actually escaping. But they took all of these troublemakers and put them into the most secure camp that they could imagine, which was Colditz Castle, which was an old, I think it's 16th century castle built on a rock plinth, so you can't tunnel out of that, and very, very secure. And the people they put in were, of course, all these determined, and in some cases mildly insane escapers. And one of them was called Pat Reed. And Pat Reed later wrote a book called The Colditz Story, all about this, all about their attempts to escape. And that book was picked up by TV and turned into a TV series. And that TV series was very, very popular at the time. And really, the game it is a continuation of that. It picks up on that TV series. The game is basically about escaping from Colditz. And as I say, the presentation is very nice because it has all these artifacts that the prisoners would make in their attempts to escape, like the false identity cards and so on and so forth. And they're used to decorate the covers of the rule books and things like that. But they're also used within the game as cards. So it has a certain sense of realism and credibility, because it's been put together in cooperation with this chap, Pat Reed, who wrote the book, The Colditz Story. As a game, it's interesting as well, because it's one of the first games I can remember playing which has a huge collaborative element. So it's up to 6 players. One player has to be the Germans, and his the objective of the Germans, is to stop the Allied players achieving their objectives, which is to escape. And the actual objective is set by the players at the start of the game. So they have to agree how many people they're going to get out within a certain time, usually. And that's interesting in its own right, because there's not many games where how you win is agreed mutually between the players before you start. Usually, board games in particular are very precise. How you win a game is one of the key elements to game design. In case of Colditz, they left it fluid. Interestingly enough, when the game was relaunched by Osprey recently, they changed that. They put a track around the outside, and every turn the track moves on, and you end the game when the track reaches its end.
And how vibrant was the gaming scene in the 70s? Was it inevitable that a company like Games Workshop would emerge from that sort of environment?
Yeah, possibly. A Games Workshop emerged as a importer of D&D. Again, you have to see it in the context of the huge growth in fantasy and the counterculture at the time, and it lives within that same sort of space. The modern Games Workshop isn't Games Workshop. I know that sounds weird, but it isn't. The modern Games Workshop is Citadel Miniatures. Citadel was founded by the people that owned Games Workshop, Steve Jackson and Ian Lewiston, and Brian Ansell, who had previously been one of the owners of Asgard Miniatures. Citadel was originally founded to produce Ralpartha Miniatures under license, and Ralpartha Miniatures were an American miniatures company that made fantasy figures. So it started to serve D&D and the role-playing market. But Brian Ansell, who ran it, had a vision that was a bit greater than that. He could see that the market for fantasy wargaming was something that was worth nurturing. Because the problem with serving a D&D market or role-playing market with miniatures is people don't want hundreds of miniatures. They just want a miniature to represent their character, and maybe if the games master, guy running the games, will have a few dozen models. So it's not a massive market, whereas traditional historical wargaming, you'd have units of 20 or 30 or up to 50 figures in a block and dozens of those. So you'd be selling hundreds of models, and often lots of the same model, which is much more profitable because you only have to pay the designer once. You get one mold and you spin it, and so it's relatively easy. Whereas having lots and lots of individual designs is expensive to buy. You have to sculpt them, you have to mold them, you have to produce them. It's much more tricky. So Brian always had this idea that we could build up the wargaming side of fantasy. And Games Workshop today, what happened was Brian eventually took over the company. And what we found was, he bought out the others. What we found was when we looked at we actually got to look at the accounts properly. None of anything else ever made any money. The only thing that made any money was Citadel Miniatures, which at that time included Warhammer. And all the role-playing, all the board games, all the puzzles, all the computer games, none of it really made any money. Brian started to then steer the company more strongly towards the profitable side, which was, at that time, Warhammer.
Before we get there, let's talk about before Games Workshop. So your next game is Reaper. So how did you come up with the idea for this game?
Reaper is a very conventional tabletop war game with for fantasy models, and it has no background. It really has because at that time that wasn't a given. For the most part, people either played within a Lord of the Rings type environment or something specific that was from literature, or they made everything up for themselves. And it was part and parcel of fantasy wargaming that you did that. There was no expectation that things should have a background. And Richard Halliwell and I were school friends, and we were part of that same gaming group, and we'd played all sorts of games, including tabletop games, together for some years, and we'd always design games together as well. It was something we just did. It was part of our sort of relationship. We both considered ourselves to be aspirant games designers at a time when actually you couldn't the idea of making a living in war games was sort of nonsensical. It really was. And we'd already had a few things published as teenagers, but they were mostly in fanzines. And I think it must have been late 70s. We started to develop our fantasy war games around a particular rule set that was, which we'd cobbled together, and that game was Reaper. From Reaper, everything else comes.
So let's move on then to Games Workshop. Was it through Brian that you got involved with Games Workshop? I
think when I left college, it was a bit tough at the time. It was 81, I think. There was it was the early days of the first Tory government, and there was massive unemployment, and people were there weren't a lot of jobs going. And I remember a lot of the people who left college with me just couldn't find work at all. So it was quite a tough time, and I didn't really want a straight job. I was. You have to bear in mind I was probably what you might call a hippie at the time. Hair down to my waist and weighing about 7 stone, including dirt. I'd already made a few toy soldiers for Asgard before I went to college, and I continued to make a few bits and pieces while I was at college just to earn a little bit of money. But Asgard actually, I won't say they went belly up, but they had Brian left during my first year, and after Brian left, my contact ended. So I didn't really do anything else after that, not for Asgard anyway. And upon leaving college, I thought I'd pick up where I'd left off. So I I must have got back in touch with Brian at some point, who might have put me in touch with Bob Connor at Tabletop Games, because I think Bob was starting to make miniatures, It's his first foray into miniature manufacture. And he asked me to make some 15mm figures for him, which I did. And eventually I made 15mm historical figures for tabletop games. For about a dozen, maybe half a dozen ranges, something like that. In those days, you really couldn't spend weeks and weeks making a miniature. Nowadays, people take, sometimes, it astonishes me, it can take up to 5 weeks for someone at Games Workshop to make a straight 28mm figure. When I was doing them, I had to make 3 15mm figures from scratch a day. So, it really was a grind. And that was just to make a very basic living. And I was still living with my parents, so you can imagine. That's kind of how I got involved with that. So Brian already knew me. When he started up with Games Workshop, he started Citadel Ventures. He was just looking for people who could do stuff. So really, it wasn't that I contacted him. He contacted me. He kept phoning me up and saying, we're stuck with mail order. Can you come and do a day's mail order? And I'd look at all these 15mm toy soldiers on my desktop and go, I'm a bit busy at the moment. And he'd say, look, we're really desperate. We'll pay you this. And this was as much as I'd earn in a week doing 15mm toy soldiers, because he built up a massive backlog. And I said, all right then. And it was a bit tricky for me, because if I had to get to Newark and I couldn't drive. So it'd be a train there and a train back and so on and so forth. But I'd turn up and I'd basically work through the mail order until it was done. If I had to stay there in the evening, whatever, I'd do it. Because I wanted to get back doing 15mm. So over time, Brian came to think of me as someone who was a good doer, just a good grafter. Because I'd get there, I'd do the work as fast as I could. I knew the ranges were fairly easy to get your head around. And the work wasn't difficult. And that's kind of how it started. So I didn't join Games Workshop to do game design. I joined Games Workshop to do mail order. In the end, Brian offered me a full-time job, and he'd done it so many times. I kept refusing, so I kept wanting to do model making and be independent. But in the end, I just had to. It was just too good an opportunity to miss. By then, a lot of my friends were also working at Citadel, including Richard Halliwell and a friend called Anthony Epworth, who had been one of our wargaming circle, and another chap called Paul Elsey, who was also one of our wargaming crew. And between them, they were doing mould making, lower management. So it's really organising the warehousing, things like that. Richard Halliwell, he was kind of part time. He was one of these people who he'd come in, work, earn some money, use it to go on a world trip, come back 6 months later, do more work, and so on and so forth. So he was there and not there a lot of the time. And he actually became a kind of independent mould maker, and then he would work for other companies too. So he'd do mould making at Citadel, then he'd do mould making at Tabletop Games, and he did mould making for a few other people as well, I think. And once he'd got the cash together, he would go and fund one of his world travels. So that was just how, which is one of the reasons why I became the person that was a chief games designer at Games Workshop and not Hal, because he just wasn't there half the time.
And so you co-wrote the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy.
Yeah.
What was the origin of the game, and what were the inspirations for the world?
Well, it wasn't really a world. The original Warhammer Fantasy game was a little bit like Reaper. It was an anywhere, anytime world. The original brief came from Brian Ansell. Brian wanted to create a fantasy war game, tabletop war game, which would have whole regiments of troops in, like Reaper. And in many ways, he wanted to that same idea, but he wanted it to use D6. So Brian gave the brief. It has to be a tabletop war game. It has to have a D6 base. You can't use fancy dice, including polyhedral dice. At the time, there were a lot of D&D players and a lot of D&D type dice. People use polyhedral dice for D&D, D4s, D8s, D12s, D10s. Those things baffled youngsters. So if you were a wannabe wargamer, let's say, at the age of 10, 11, 12, up to 14. D&D was a bit college kids. It was a little bit advanced for you. And you had a Monopoly set in which you had dice, but you didn't have access to all these polyhedral dice, which were expensive and you could only get from specialist suppliers. So, it had to be D6. And the other thing Brian said was that you had to have rules for every single model we made, which kind of fell upon me, really. And we had quite a big range, but it was mostly it was a sort of D&D style range. So there was lots of bits. I was busy doing mail order promotions and catalogue work, anything like that. I was really quite busy at the time. And you didn't pay people to sit and write war games in those days. The idea was laughable. What you did was you published a game somebody had written independently, and you gave them a small royalty for it, or you bought it outright for a pittance. But games designers and games writers were not, it wasn't a job. It would be too expensive because it takes months to design a war game. To actually sit to pay someone to do it was unthinkable. So we all did work out of house. Even if we worked for Games Workshop, we did work out of house. So, for example, I wrote the Judge Dredd role-playing game a few years later, and that was entirely done out of house, and published by Games Workshop. Even though it was a Games Workshop game, and I worked for Games Workshop, I didn't get to write it in Games Workshop's time. As I say, didn't work like that. Warhammer was quite a big project, and what we did was we got Richard Halliwell to write it. So Brian briefed it, which he would have done verbally. I probably wrote up the brief. I can't remember doing that, but I must have done. And then I coordinated the thing with Hal, and Richard Halliwell and I wrote the game together because we always worked on things together. So it was Hal's commission, and he took the lead design role, but we both worked on it. And I think I designed the entire magic system again. Hal didn't like doing magic systems. I really like magic systems. But Hal did the core game mechanics. I then edited and wrote it up. But I then had to make sure that requirement that we had rules for everything went in. So all the things like Hal would have done all the basic stats, and he probably did most of the work on the core ranges because he would have known what they were. But new things were added all the time. So I would have then updated it. And Hal wrote a scenario, which had a little bit of background in, but it was a sort of capture. It's like a role-playing scenario. Here's a situation. These guys are doing this. They've got to go through these series of adventures, i.e. little battles, and achieve this objective. I think it's kill a dragon, take its treasure, something like that. So the game had a massive role-playing element to it. It wasn't completely a tabletop war game. It had to have that because at the time, and this was another of Brian's briefing points, you couldn't sell a game that didn't have the word role-play on it. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? But at that time, and for many years afterwards, if you wrote a war game, it almost had to have the word role-playing on it because otherwise a shop wouldn't buy it. So it became a mass combat fantasy role-playing game. That was what I think it was labelled. And it had some basic rules which allowed you to progress and retain and progress characters, which is what role-playing is at heart. And it had a games master. So the idea was that two people would play, but ideally they would be a third party who would adjudicate and control any elements that were third party. That was actually true of all the Warhammer series right up until, I think, 3rd edition. There was an assumption that people wouldn't necessarily play like that. You could play with just 2 players, so long as you had that collaborative element. And Reaper had it as well, in fact. And Warhammer had that too, initially. So Richard Halliwell wrote the game, core rules. I contributed to that. I brought the whole thing together with Tony Ackland, in fact, and we added a lot of incidental detail. the background wasn't really there, but we added little bits and pieces to give the races and individuals character. And the background really grew out of that characterization of the model ranges, particularly when we started to do supplements. And we introduced something called Regiments of Renown, where you bought a 10-figure set that had either a standard bearer or an officer in it, or a musician, in fact. And if you bought all three, then you had a full regiment, regiment of troops, including its leader, a standard bearer, and a musician, which all had special rules in the game. But each one of those was a specific thing. It had a name, like I think sort of Hobboth's Black Mountain Boys, something like that, which was a set of orc warriors. So I had to invent the background for those things, and they all had it was quite formulaic. They all had a background, and they all had a name, and the regimental champions all had a name and a little bit of back history. And from those things, the Warhammer world started to emerge.
What was the original reaction to the game when it came out? And did you think at the time that Warhammer would end up being the behemoth that it became?
No, I don't think we had any idea at the time that it was going to be quite so massive, but I think we thought it was reasonably successful. I mean, we enjoyed it. We had lots of fun putting it together, and I think that comes across. It's not exhaustively play tested and balanced in the way that a modern war game is, or which people expect modern war games to be. It's more like an old-fashioned role-playing game where that particular aspect of it is all down to the games master. The games master has to make it balanced, and if something's going a bit awry, he has to intervene. So we thought it would be reasonably successful, and it was actually way more successful than perhaps we'd even hoped. It sold out very quickly. We got lots of mail back, mostly from younger players, because it was aimed at younger players in a way. Brian wanted to build up that market. What he was trying to do was recreate the experience that he had had, and which me and Hal and all our friends had had as young teenagers growing up. We'd started wargaming when we were 11, 12, and by the time we were 18 and we were playing in clubs, we tended to look down upon all the younger players, little spotty kids. I don't know, what do they know? And there was a huge amount of snobbery, particularly as the game's more complex and sophisticated. They almost define themselves in terms of, no, these are serious games. They'll be played by people who are intellectual and college sort of caliber. And that put off a lot of the younger kids. But Brian wanted to be open about it. And so Warhammer, in many ways, it was aimed at a younger market. But having said that, a lot of the humour in it was college-style humour. It was sort of Monty Python-esque, it was sixth-form humour to some extent. And Hal and I had that kind of thing going. We'd grown up with a certain irreverence, which stemmed from, I'd say, Monty Python, but also radio shows like, I'm sorry, I'll read that again. There was a lot of radio humour. It was quite anarchic in the 60s and early 70s. And Warhammer encapsulated all of that. So it was very successful. We had to reprint it very quickly. The thing about it that I would say was it was produced very quickly by me and Tony, and it was never really properly edited or proofread. I mean, I edited it in the sense of I took Hal's text and I, to some extent, rewrote it and corrected it where necessary. But the standard English is quite appalling. In the first edition of Warhammer, I really banged it out, and the people at Games Workshop, who were much more professional in terms of their approach, and employed professional editors for that matter, because they did White Wolf magazine, they were appalled by what they saw as this very badly produced and amateurishly produced thing, and it was quite amateurish, really. So we very quickly moved on to a second edition, which was produced in the same amateurish way, but with slightly higher standards. So the standard of English in it is a little bit more considered. I'd learned how to spell manoeuvrability, for example. And as I say, bear in mind, this is in the days before proper word processing software and spell checkers and things like that. There's a whole series of things were done for the first and second edition, which predate any kind of spell checker or artificial assistance in any way. but they all stemmed from that original Warhammer. So that was the reactions. Professionally, horror, but commercially, very successful. And the kids, and I would say kids, it sounds a bit patronising, but the people who were buying it, the players who invested in it very quickly, really loved it, and it became massively popular very, very quickly, and started to sell large amounts of models in its own right. And then we started to redesign the ranges to go with Warhammer rather than to go with D&D.
So your next game then is a very famous game, and it's ended up being, the miniature war game, and this is Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. So was it just a matter of fantasy has been successful, we should do a sci-fi one now?
Yeah, largely. I mean, I've included Warhammers all together as one thing, including Rogue Trader. I'm afraid I might have cheated there. But I couldn't really talk about Rogue Trader without talking about Warhammer, because Rogue Trader was just a science fiction version of the Warhammer mechanically. The game system is the same game system. I just rewrote it for a science fiction background. The thing that makes 40k different, and to this day distinguishes it from anything else, is its background, its backstory, which was something which I did. Now we're still in the days when you don't actually get paid to write war games. Goodness no, you do them in your own time. So 40k, the original version, Rogue Trader, was written by me as an out-of-house project. So I wrote all of that game in my own time. As I say, the thing that makes it different really is the backstory, and I came up with that backstory really to do that game. I had already designed a game called Rogue Trader, which was a spaceship combat game, and role-playing game, in fact. And I'd designed a range of toy soldiers. I'd actually made the toy soldier, the spaceships, to go with that range. And when I joined Games Workshop, when Brian eventually persuaded me with money, to join, was then Citadel Miniatures, I had that range of spaceships, and I had the game in manuscript. And one of the things I said was, yeah, okay, I will join Games Workshop, but I don't want to give up on this Rogue Trader game I've done. Can I do it one day? Can we produce this game one day? And Brian said, yeah, one day we'll produce that Rogue Trader, but you have to do this Warhammer Fantasy thing first. So there was always this tacit understanding that Rogue Trader would be produced. And there's actually an advert for that original game in one of the early Citadel Compendium magazines that we produced. So you can see the original Rogue Trader outlined in that advert, which was in 1983, I think. But by the time we came to do Rogue Trader, time had moved on. It was 1986, 1987. 1987 it was published. 86 is when I wrote it, I guess. Warhammer Fantasy had become so popular that I'd started to just play science fiction games using those same rules. And that really was the basis of Rogue Trader. We had to call it Rogue Trader because we'd already advertised that we'd got this game called Rogue Trader, even though it wasn't that game. We had this continual when's Rogue Trader coming out thing going on. Every time we went to a games day or an open day at Citadel, we'd be deluged with youngsters, teenagers, even older players, say, when's Rogue Trader coming out? And it became a bit of a joke. So the original Warhammer 40k had to be called Rogue Trader. It had to have Rogue Trader as a byline, just so we could draw a line underneath that whole thing. And in fact, the spaceship rules which I'd designed, called Rogue Trader, were supposed to go in that book. But in the end, there wasn't space. The book's quite big. So they were dropped from the book. So the thing they're named after didn't go in the book. And the spaceship range I'd made was just incorporated into the generic spaceships that Games Workshop sold at the time.
Now, I know what you're thinking. What do I actually get if I join the 5 Games for Doomsday Patreon? Deploy Salesman Voice! An absolute ton of bonus content is the answer. You can get some of this.
A war of whispers.
Whispers, you say?
I'm doing a stage whisper. I'm not actually whispering.
What's the difference?
Well, because actually what I'm doing is actually talking, whereas you're whispering. That's the difference, because I'm a trained actor and you're like a techo.
Or this. Nostalgia infects. It's a pernicious virus that leaches into the ripples of the brain. It's a neurotoxin that affects behaviour. As reality of life and death sinks in, nostalgia, previously dormant, starts to pull levers in the psyche. And maybe even a little bit of this.
Like smoking a fag or drinking a pint. Maybe having something to eat or a little bit of a shag. All things, Steve, must come to an end.
For as little as $5 a month, you can get Battle Reports, where me and the fragrant Steven Cyrek report on a game as it's being played. Thoughts from the cabin. You like pretentious? Then you'll love these. And I even sometimes go outside and ask the hard-hitting questions that never needed asking. To get all this and a feeling of smug superiority, just go to patreon.com/5G4D. Join the community and help me eat. That's patreon.com/5G4D. Because content never tasted so good. So good. God, I feel dirty.
So you talk about what made it stand out was the lore, was the story behind it. And Warhammer 40k is, I mean, at this point, completely labyrinthine. What's really interesting is that it has the lore of 40k has a very interesting relationship with the notion of organized religion. And was it you who came up with this idea, and does that reflect your own attitudes?
Well, I don't know. I'd be a bit wary about saying it reflected my own attitudes because it is quite a dystopia and also intentionally I'd say a parody, but it's not meant to be taken entirely seriously. It's set when I created that backstory, I was inspired by to some extent real religious institutions in the Middle Ages. But also things like the Nemesis stories in 2000 AD, which there are some parallels with, and the Dune books by Frank Herbert, which there are parallels with, and which themselves parallel historical religious organisations to some extent. It also draws upon ideas that are in I think it's the Hawkman books from Michael Moorcock, although I think people make a bit too much of that. I wasn't really in the forefront of my mind, but it has that sort of God Emperor idea. And also a book called Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, in which humanity is gradually morphing into a psychically aware or advanced species, which is vulnerable and which has to be nursed by an alien race that comes down who look very devilish, in fact. So there are lots of popular science fiction concepts all merged together to produce the background to 40k. I think the idea of it being a sort of, I'll say comic, but I don't really mean that. A kind of dystopia that you can then mock. It is closest to the Nemesis stories in 2000 AD, where you have exactly that. The ridicule of society and of attitudes it is quite well outlined in those 2000 AD strips, and I think I brought it over into that universe I created. And I'll say the reason I had all that in my head was so strongly was because I'd only just written the Judge Dredd role-playing game. So I sat down with the first, I think it might have been 300 editions of 2000 AD and read every single Judge Dredd strip. But it has that that insane dystopia, that insane but amusing dystopia, in which a guy is running around and he's judge, jury, and executioner in one man. And what a horrible concept! It's a totalitarian Nazi state if you think about it. But at the same time, the stories are all they're all not mocking necessarily of that institution, but they're mocking of the society which makes that institution a necessity. And that's the same is true in my original concept of Rogue Trader. There's a lot of humour in Rogue Trader. I think that humour disappeared from the series as other people took it forward, and as the background story progressed. And I've not had a lot to do with it for many years, so I don't necessarily keep up. But I get the impression that the modern version is almost devoid of any kind of abstraction in that sense. It's treated as if it were a serious thing, which I think is probably not very healthy. It's a world in which only the insane have strength enough to prosper, which is one of the things. And it really is. It's like the belief in things which are, from a modern perspective, blatantly not true, is the thing that motivates people and moves society.
When I came up against 40k in the late 80s when I was a kid, I was instantly attracted to the orcs. And the reason being is that heroes are boring, even though, obviously the Space Marines aren't heroes in the conventional sense. But I loved the way that orcs kind of, they pricked the pomposity of, the conventional notion of the hero. Was it important that you had something in there that was expressly comic in the way that the other factions weren't?
Yeah, and I think they acquired those characteristics, and it became a natural home for a lot of that humour. Brian Ansell, he became a sort of champion for the orcs in 40k, and he wrote a whole series of rather sprawling supplements via Nigel Stillman mostly, I think, and a few other writers. Brian never wrote anything himself. He was one of these. He would come up with ideas, and he would use a little tape recorder called dictaphone. He would use a dictaphone, and he would just kind of stream of consciousness into this dictaphone, and his secretary would write up those notes, often struggling because the secretary would be not necessarily familiar with references to Venetian artists of the 17th century that Brian would often drop in, and these often quite lengthy memos would appear on somebody's desk. Turn this into a game. Turn this into. And poor old Nigel Stillman, he often got that job. He sent him a bit mad in the end, but and that's where things like War of the Orcs come from. But Brian would come up with a lot of these things, and a lot of his ideas were humorous, or based on humours or absurdities, and they were easy to pick up on and work with. He was a good source of ideas, Brian. Better not detail, and sometimes you had to kind of pick the ideas that would work amongst all the ideas that wouldn't work. But brilliantly inspiring, I have to say. And those orc books that he created, probably the basis for the orcs in later time. When I wrote orcs up in the original Rogue Trader, I don't think they had quite that character. I did them more as kind of barbarians. So you've probably got Brian to thank for that element. But they certainly gave you character. I have to say, that when you do war games world building, one of the things I like to do is make sure that there are factions which appeal to different people, to people who have different aesthetics and different attitudes. So you always have a race that's a little bit po-faced for the serious gamers, and you tend to design their rules and the way they look around that. And then you have things for the guys who just like to play. And I think orcs are people who like to play and experience playing rather than hardcore winning. So you have lots of chancy stuff that it doesn't really matter if you're a hardcore player. This will still win you the game now and again. And on the other hand, it might easily lose you the game, but hey, never mind. And orcs encapsulate that. And I always try and make anything I did, when I was working for Games Workshop and I was working on orcs, I always tried to make orcs fulfill that kind of role. The Eldar again are more the po-faced guys. One of the most po-faced really, but they tend to also attract they've got a lot of hippy dippy elements. They are the you have ley lines in space. They're that kind of character to them. And Jez Goodwin and I got together, and Jez came up with a lot of the ideas behind the Eldar and then how they would be developed. And we share a common interest and background in that sort of thing. They often reference Celtic mythology, for example. Who was it? Yeah, I mean, something like the Imperial Guard, very straight. Somebody who likes the military stuff and a combined arms force. Space Marines, always elite army, small force. So somebody doesn't want to collect a big army, but they want it to be tough. So smaller force, but strong. And then Tyranids. Some people like playing aliens. There you are, completely wacko. So aliens, wacko. And I think over the years, a few more things got added, but to some extent, that already sums up your basics. And when I did say Necromunda years later, you see it's got six. The original Necromunda game has 6 factions, and each of those factions corresponds to one of those ideas. You have 6 manners of play. It's the same with fantasy. You've got the dwarves, who are the very technical, engineering based. I did. We deliberately pushed each of those factions into a role.
So I want to talk now about sort of leaving Games Workshop and your life after. To what degree do you attribute the success of Games Workshop, Games Workshop became, the colossus astride the gaming industry, down to the work that you did during the 80s and 90s?
Well, I don't know. After designing 40K, I went on to be kind of chief design. We gradually lost our design team because most of our designers were working on role-play stuff. And we sort of lost them, or they became peripheral to the business. Even though they continued to do some very good stuff in their own way, it wasn't commercially working for us. And I sort of progressed into a management role. I'd originally been the studio manager when the studio was 3 or 4 people, very nominally, because Tony Ackland was there as well, and Tony's unmanageable, as we all know. We remain friends to this day. So, later on, I just became a designer. We employed so many people. But by the late 80s, 90s, the studio had started to fall apart a bit. It really was becoming a bit dysfunctional. And I gradually sort of took over some of the elements of it, and I sort of formed this little cell within the studio, and I produced games within that cell, so I was managing a cell within the studio. And gradually that cell took over the rest of the studio until really I was studio manager. And I think when Brian Ansell sold the company, I don't think I was technically studio manager at the time. I think Phil Gallagher was, but he was not really managing the studio. Bear in mind, the studio was not just making games, it was also publishing White Dwarf, it was organising print. So we did all the print buying for the first print. We did all model design. One stage we did the initial moulding, so we had a press set up in the studio, model press to make masters. We did all the legals and all the licensing. And we organised all the plastic tooling. So the studio was quite a big part of Games Workshop. It wasn't just designing games. The current studio is less than that. What they now call their studio is really what would have been just our design office. It just one part of it. So I gradually took over more and more responsibility, and I became studio manager in the early 90s. So I was then responsible for everything, including the plastic tooling, and to some extent the strategy. It wasn't just the make this stuff, it was what stuff are we going to make, Rick? So by the time we were ready to do the 4th edition of Warhammer, and that'd be 1992. In fact, it's 1991, because the first thing I remember doing was Epic Space Marine. That was the first thing. It was probably the first big game that was probably done under my watch in 1991. But by the time we did Warhammer 4th edition and then 40K 2nd edition, I was running the studio and effectively running the what we call the offer. Deciding what models to make, what games to release, and when to release them. When to release them was a negotiated thing, because the sales part of the business always had to have so many releases every month, and you couldn't just say, no, we're going to release this game in June. You had to go, we're making this game, this is the sort of window we can make it within. And the sales guys would always come back and go, well, we really need a big game to release for Christmas, which has to come out in September. I go, right, so we'll aim for that date, sort of September, and that's coincidentally when we organised Games Day. So often things would be released at Games Day. So you had a kind of a background to the year, a pulse of when we release games. But within that, I decided what to release. Again, I would propose what we were doing the following year. That would be talked through with the sales guys. So to that extent, between, let's say, 1991 and probably 97, 98, I was responsible for the entire output of Games Workshop in terms of all the models and all the games, as well as overseeing all the legal licensing, computer game licensing, for example, licensing with Hasbro, and the plastics. At that time, the plastics were made by a third party, so we had a budget which was massive, and I had an ambition to ultimately turn Games Workshop into a company that made plastic toy soldiers, not metal toy soldiers, and we worked towards that end. I still continue to do a lot of the primary games design because I enjoyed doing that. But as time went on, we trained up and passed that responsibility on. So that after 1996, I was able to step back from doing games design. And I did continue to do some games design, but there were only things that I personally wanted to do, or where someone had perhaps not achieved what they were supposed to achieve. If somebody left the business halfway through a project, it didn't happen often, but could happen, then you had to step in. So I'd sometimes do that to help the team out. And the games did, and I was always their boss. So sometimes the team would come to me with a proposal about something, like it might be the way we were going to do the Tyranids, or later on it might be the way we were going to do 3rd edition 40k. And they'd talk it through with me. And I generally okay. And if there's something I was unsure about, I would go, tell me why you want to do that. And then they would explain. And I'd go, yeah, that's great. I think that's really interesting to do that. Or I'd go, you haven't considered this other thing. Usually it'd be a sales perspective, because those guys, they're gamers, they're games designers. They're not they don't have that holistic experience of the commercial business, which, because of the way I'd grown up through the business, doing mail order actually, in the very early days and everything, I'd got a far broader or more holistic view of how the business worked. And so I had that overview, which I was able to continue to bring to the business. And then after 1996, I became a director of the business, and the company was sold onto the stock market. So again, my role changed. I became part of an executive rather than part of the games design, which I didn't enjoy so much, but it did pay a lot better. So I was one of the people running the business on board level for a good while, and yeah. So how much was it down to me? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure that 40k could have existed as it exists now had I not done that original game and then steered it through its first few years. But other people contributed too, including steering it, like Brian Ansell. When we talked about Orcs earlier, I don't think Orcs would have been what Orcs are had Brian not stepped in and given them that huge character injection. And Brian, whilst he was in charge, I think he sold the business in about 1991. His last few years when he was there, he wasn't really there. He was preparing to leave the business, which, if you're about to come into many millions of pounds, all the people that I know who have done this have spent the preceding year abroad avoiding paying tax. And Brian was in either Guernsey or in the British Virgin Islands. So he wasn't running the business day to day in the way he had been, or contributing in the way he had been. And the same thing happened later on with Tom Kirby when he sold the business. He basically went to he lives in the Isle of Man now. So that tells you something, doesn't it? So the whole thing, yeah. I contributed, and perhaps I gave it the initial steer, but I think a lot of other people helped shape that game and the company.
And so what finally gave you the impetus to leave after you'd been there for so long?
Well, I didn't have much choice in the matter. I had been there a long time, but at the time Games Workshop was doing quite poorly, and my role as part of the executive, it had stepped down in a series of, let's call it professionalizations. What had happened is the company had got to a size where it was decided that people who were gamers and came from that background were holding it back rather than enabling it to grow. And so my friend John Stallard left. He of course, had been in that category. He'd been running the sales, all the sales. So, trade, mail order, what we call mail order, called direct these days, and the distribution, what we call distribution, which is a large part of the business at the time, where you're selling to people who then distribute to other traders. So John left after a period of in which he was asked to try and run our American business, which he did with reasonable success. But it was always felt that by that time the business had become, we'd gone from being £10 million turnover, which was roughly where we were when Brian sold the company, and a lot of that on the back of 40k, to being something like 70 or 80 million pound turnover. And businesses change, and we'd also, when Brian sold the company, we acquired a huge debt from venture capitalists, which we'd had to borrow the money to buy the company. And that debt was personal, it was Tom Kirby, so he had to basically turn the business into something which could pay off that debt, which meant growing the business. And to do that, he acquired a whole series of foreign businesses, including a French business, a German business, a Spanish business. Bearing in mind they were all people we'd been dealing with before, but suddenly the whole product range had to change to meet the requirements of those foreign businesses. And suddenly running the business from the top meant having to deal with all the legislation in those countries. You can imagine it's different, it's complicated. We started to take on people who were city professionals, who had run businesses rather than run toy soldier companies. And some of them, to be honest, I think were disasters and had the worst ideas. They just, because at the end of the day, a toy soldier business is still a toy soldier business. But I think Tom himself never quite saw that and time after time we tried. And in the end, I think the business it kind of retreated into a kind of bastion of, we do what we do, we can't do anything else, we'll continue to do what we do. And meanwhile, they tried to get professional people in to run the factory and run the warehousing and so on and so forth, none of whom had much idea about the detail of the toy soldier. A toy soldier business is weird because you've got lots and lots and lots of what we call SKUs, or individual items, all of which are handmade and subject to variability. You go to most manufacturers and they make a widget. It's a bit for a double glazing company. And every widget's identical and they all have to meet certain specifications. Toy soldiers, not like that. Very, very different. And increasingly, those professional people would try and apply those professional things. So they'd look at a range of toy soldiers and go, well, you're selling 100 of them, but you're only selling one of them. You're not making any money on this one because it's way too difficult to keep it in production. So we're going to delete that from the range. What they've just done is delete the general from the army. Now you can buy the army, but you can no longer buy a general for it. Every army has to have a general. Every wargamer knows that. But now you can no longer buy it because the professionals have identified it as not profitable enough. It's like that. That's the sort of thing that happened all the time. And in that context, my role became one of being increasingly the person who'd point out things don't work. And nobody likes that person. And when that person's a senior executive, it tends to mean one thing: you can't really be there. And in the end, after a year of trying to set up a little division within Games Workshop, which was ridiculously underfunded, and I think could only really go one way. I did leave, and I think it was probably, if not the right time, a little bit too late. If anything, I should have left earlier. Interestingly enough, for about 7 years after I left, Games Workshop did very, very badly using that same model, just trying again, getting the professional people, not doing anything new, cutting back on its media presence and relationships with customers. Games Workshop became a company that hated its customers because its customers are all gamers. And it didn't like gamers, it just wanted people that bought its product. There were no gamers with any position of authority within the company. And when Tom Kirby retired, I think the people below him had a good opportunity to look around. Because Brian sold, basically, he left the company. He was the chairman at the time. Still a massive shareholder, and I don't doubt that it's made him many, many millions. But when he retired, I think the people that had been running the business just took another look at it and thought, Brian, it's Tom. For years, Tom's been saying, don't do these things because it'll only ruin the business. Perhaps we could just give them a bit of a try. And they started to re-engage with their media, and they started to re-engage with the way they presented the games. And it's just made a fantastic change, and the whole business has suddenly taken off. The irony is, a lot of the things that they're now doing, including the licensing to third parties, and the revision of the games, and engagement with the players, are all things that I would have been advocating and which would have been slammed down. So I'm quite pleased to see the Games Workshops come back in strength, and I feel slightly vindicated in terms of what the company is. I think the company is something far closer to what I think my comrades and I, in particular people like John Stallard, would have liked it to have been all along. Yeah.
So your next game then is a game you designed while you were at Games Workshop, and this is the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game. What was the challenge of taking something as beloved as Lord of the Rings and putting it on the tabletop?
Yeah, that's really an example of both of the later days of the company and one of the great problems. By the time that the Lord of the Rings films came along, I was in that executive role. No one in the business at the highest levels, right down, wanted to do Lord of the Rings or have anything to do with it. I'd always loved Lord of the Rings. It was one of the first things that inspired me to do fantasy wargaming. Some of the first miniatures I ever collected for fantasy wargaming were the Middle-earth range made by Miniature Figurines in the early 1970s. I thought we should do it. And I was talking to a friend and another co-worker of mine, Andy Jones, in the coffee room. We were just making a cup of coffee. And I was going, I think it's a real shame we're not interested in pursuing a license to do Lord of the Rings. Well, Andy was our chief licensing officer at the time, and he said, I'd really like to do it as well. And I said, well, why don't we come up with a plan? So me and Andy together cooked up a plan. We said, look, we could do it. We'd do it like this. We'd make a game based on Warhammer, and we produce a range that looks something like this. And we took that plan to do a product, really, to what was then the executive. We basically got permission to do it. We persuaded the then managing director. He got behind it, and I thought, well, that's great. Let's go for it. Andy got in touch with the licensing people. It was New Line Cinema, and we basically put a pitch. They invited us over to pitch. We put a pitch together, and myself, Andy, or MD, Chris Prentice, he was called, and I think it was John Blanche. Yeah, it was John Blanche. We went over to New York to the offices of New Line Cinema with a whole batch of models and a slideshow projector. Yeah, so a PowerPoint. and we made a pitch for to do the range, and we basically got that license, and it was just really quite thrilling going to New York and pitching to the licensing guys at New Line, David Imhoff, who he was called, very sharp operators. These are New York executives in very flash suits, and the offices are just fantastic. It's another world. It really was. So it was an opportunity to do things like that. Because we worked so far ahead in those days, by the year 2000, and the studio, which is not run by me anymore, basically the sales companies had increasingly demanded the studio work further and further ahead, for no good reason that I could see, but always so that, in theory, so that they could prepare and market. But that meant that the studio was committed to doing work for the next 3 years, so no one could actually design this Lord of the Rings game. So I stepped in and designed it. Hooray! I mean, I wanted to design it, so it wasn't a problem. So it was a little bit of back to my core competencies for me, even though I was by that time I was a non-executive by that time. So my relationship was entirely within the people running the business, but I was acting as a sort of, I was an executive, but I was acting as a non-specific role, without portfolio, if you like. And it certainly gave me something to do day to day, which was a little bit more interesting. And I came up with that game. And it's another toy soldier war game, but it was quite innovative. I think it was actually quite influential in the way it works, although perhaps a lot of games have a similar kind of precept these days. So it's not quite so innovative as it once was. But I put it together. A friend of mine who I'd worked with on another game called Warmaster helped me, and that's Stefan Hess. Stefan's a game player, but also very, very acute designer. He was a German, Berlin, in fact. He lives in Berlin. He founded or co-founded a computer games company. And as the programmer, technical end of it, and he sold that during the dot boom and made himself independently wealthy. And because he had that computer tech knowledge, he's fantastically good on crunching the numbers, way better than me. And he developed a series of little apps which I could use to do combat simulations. And I could feed in different factors and variations into this little simulator, and it would make a calculation. And so I mentioned Lord of the Rings because it was so unusual. It happened at a time when I wasn't really a games designer, but I still got to design a game. Hooray! And it was fantastically successful again. It was so successful, it almost doubled the business overnight. And that caused Games Workshop problems because they couldn't cope with the success. The success was so great that none of the sales companies could have the discipline to control their spending because they were all treated as independent businesses. So their incomes went through the roof, and they therefore decided to invest in bigger offices, more staff, and expanded their businesses without thinking in terms of this Lord of the Rings. It might just be a bit of a blip caused by the film. Unless you use that money and then invest in building up your Warhammer and 40k businesses, it could cause you problems down the line. And we always knew that. It was an absolute known thing from the start. And we always said success is an empty warehouse when it came to Lord of the Rings because we knew it could never last forever. At least not in the hyper successful fashion that it did when the films came out. And similarly, the warehouses got in a muddle and overstocked with it, and it just became one of those things that the processes of running a company failed to cope with. So the biggest failure of Games Workshop was to deal with success, and that success therefore became seen as a failure. And it was referred to as the Games Workshop. It was referred to as the Lord of the Rings effect, meaning so great in terms of its impact on the business couldn't cope with it. I personally always refer to it as the Games Workshop management failure. It's a failure of management, not a failure of the game. And I thought that it was very badly served within Games Workshop by being regarded almost universally as a bad thing.
So you left Games Workshop, and how strange was it to be out on your own after so many years sort of working within one company?
Yeah, it was a bit... I was 50 when I left. It was a bit strange. And, I'd been paid very well at Games Workshop. And it really wasn't possible to go... The odd thing about being at Games Workshop was the skill set I had was quite valuable to Games Workshop, particularly in terms of providing that overview of the business. And it was only the fact that Games Workshop themselves didn't really decided not to take advantage of that, or thought that overview was not useful, that made my role redundant. And but that was where my value lay, not as a games designer. When you talk to people and you say, I've got a games, they'll say, that's great. You can have a tiny, tiny royalty, which will earn you almost nothing, or we'll pay you almost nothing. So as a games designer, you can't really make a living. But that was where my reputation was. And as a person with an overview on how to run a toy soldier business, there's nothing as big as Games Workshop, so there's nowhere that has that role. On the whole, those roles are subsumed within the ownership of the business. The people who own it are the people that know how to run it and what makes a good toy soldier and what makes a good range. And even if they don't know those things, they think they do. So there's no real... there was no real role for me, really. So I thought, well, I need to just do something, and I need to earn a little bit of pin money, if only to just pay the basic bills. So I just started doing work for magazines and work for, writing the odd article, and the odd thing for other people, including, not least, Warlord Games in Nottingham. Now, Warlord Games was founded by John Stallard after he left Games Workshop. And he'd already published Black Powder, which is the game I think is number 5 on my list, which was a game I wrote for Warhammer Historical. Warhammer Historical itself was a bit of a hobby horse set up within Games Workshop by me and the Perrys and Jervis Johnson to publish historical war games that we just fancied doing. It really was a hobby horse. And of course, as people left the business, or their influence within the business was, fell off, Warhammer Historical became a fly in the ointment, or for Games Workshop, and they just gradually ousted it. Never liked, always seen as an interloper. But I'd written this game called Black Powder that was going to be published by Warhammer Historical. And when John left the business, he said, well, can I publish Black Powder? And at the time, Games Workshop weren't really supporting the historical arm very well. They weren't madly enthusiastic about it. John Stallard had helped develop that game. And so I went to, it might have been Chris Prentice, the MD at the time, and said, well, this is okay by me. Can John have it? It's part of his leave. John was leaving the business. It's part of our sort of like, thanks John, it's part of his package, if you like. So it was agreed that John would publish Black Powder with his company. And bearing in mind all the work that had been done on Black Powder had been done in our own time. It wasn't something being done within Games Workshop's time. It's just that my contract of employment didn't allow me to work for anyone else or to do something for anyone else, which is effectively what Black Powder would be. That was where it was an issue. But it was all agreed, and we did publish it, and we did Black Powder. And Black Powder was a really good, interesting game. I was very proud of it, and it to some extent goes back to an earlier time when Wargamers had an umpire to decide upon the details of what happens in some situations, or set up the games, and certainly to run them. And the game system itself is based on my War Master game, the one that I developed with my German friend, Stefan Hess. So the game system is a development of another system I wrote, and which I couldn't include because I can only have 5 games. But War Master was a game which I was very proud of the mechanical elements of that game. Black Powder, I'd like to end with, because it reintroduces a lot of elements about wargaming, including that collaborative element we talked about right at the beginning with Escape from Colditz, where you have to agree on your terms, how many people are going to escape within what time. And the role-playing of Reaper and the early Warhammers. It has that collaborative element to it, and it also has the third party, the umpire, taking a major role in it. It's also designed to be a multiplayer game. So ideally, and almost always when I play, you play with 2 or 3 players on each side. And the reason for that, as much as anything, is that we tend to play big games, and the game system is kind of focused on large scale actions. But it also means when you state your orders, I'm going to charge that unit that's on the hill, all the guys on your side are looking at you askance going, oh my God, he's gone mad, what's he done? And all the guys on the other side are going, you'll never make it. And then you make your dice test, and let's say you don't make it, and all the guys on the other side are suddenly grinning like Cheshire cats and go, foolish man, you never stood a chance. And all the players on your side have got their head in their hands and going, oh, what have you done? And you've now moved your unit right in front of his guns, accidentally, of course. That's why I like Black Powder. It gives you that immense personal social interaction, which was also there right at the beginning with Escape from Colditz, where you have 5 players collaborating on one side, trying to get away. Thank you.
I've got one last question then. So you're heading out of Nottingham, you're heading into the countryside, fleeing the apocalypse, and you go around a corner, the back door of the car flies open, 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a river, and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
Yeah, I knew you'd ask that question. You go, well, which one is it? I suppose of all the games I've done and of all the games I've played, the thing that really has been most influential in my life has to be Warhammer, in all its incarnations. But if I have to pick one, it's got to be Rogue Trader. And not just because it's a game I wrote, or it's a game which a lot of people collaborated on to. And it kind of summarises all those things to me, all those people, as well as all the people that worked later, and all the relationships I had at Games Workshop, and where I worked for nearly 30 years. It has to be that one. Although I'm very reluctant to name the game that I designed, but then I've designed most of these games, I'm afraid, because I think really my life has been as a games designer more than as a games player, I have to admit. But there you go, it has to be Rogue Trader.
So if people want to get hold of you, if people want to see what you're up to and get updates on things that are coming out from you, how can they go about doing that?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I don't generally accept new followers simply because I've reached the limit that Facebook allows you. But I do. I'm on Facebook, and I do have my website, which is. I think it's. It might be as even as rickpriestley.com. I can't quite remember. But the main address for it is This Gaming Life. So if you search on This Gaming Life, I think it's .co.uk, .co.uk, yeah. You'll find me, and I can be contacted on that. Although I might take a day or two to find your mail if you send me one. But other than that, I consider myself to be retired. I mean, I don't really design games anymore. There's a lot of work goes into a game design. I don't think people always quite appreciate it. Even something that's as huge and rambling as a tabletop wargame or a fantasy tabletop wargame, there's a lot of work and a great deal of games playing. You have to have that group of friends. You have to have that group which you play with regularly. And I still do, but none of them are interested in games design of new games, though. We play a lot of Black Powder. And we play a lot of Hail Caesar, which is a historical ancient version of Black Powder. So we play that game a lot and enjoy it, and to some extent the other Warlord games, Bolt Action, which is a World War II, and Beyond the Gates of Antares, which is a science fiction version. But most of the people I play with don't really want to play science fiction or fantasy games. I think it's because so many of my friends are ex-Games Workshop. We've had enough of it. In our working lives, we've seen enough science fiction and fantasy. And the things we're almost entirely interested in are all historical games.
Brilliant. Well, Rick Priestley, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Ben. Cheerio.
You can support the show in many ways. You can tell your friends, you can talk about it on social media, you can talk about it in your own blog, podcast or video, or you can support it directly by going to patreon.com/5G4D for a rolling donation, or for a one-off donation, hitting the PayPal link at the bottom of the website, 5gamesfordoomsday.com. It's these donations that keep the show going. Also, if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on Twitter at 5gamesfordoomsday, or send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. And if I've managed to flee from the unreliable cats and happiness being a cigar called Hamlet, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.